Captain Patricia Donovan stood in the officers' quarters at Long Bin in August 1967 and made a decision that would eventually create one of the most significant scandals involving American and Australian military personnel during the Vietnam War. She sent a note to an Australian officer she had met weeks earlier at an officers' club event. The note was simple and direct. "Come to my quarters tonight after 2200 hours." Donovan was 29 years old, an Army intelligence officer with a background in languages and cryptography. She had been assigned to Vietnam in March 1967 and had been working in the intelligence section at MACV headquarters. She was intelligent, capable, and had developed a reputation as one of the most competent intelligence officers in her unit, regardless of gender. She was also unattached, confident in her sexuality, and apparently unwilling to conform to the implicit restrictions that military culture placed on female officers' personal behavior. The Australian officer who received the note was Major David Ashton, 32 years old, an Australian intelligence officer who had been assigned to work with MACV intelligence as a liaison. Ashton was experienced, professional, and apparently surprised by Donovan's directness. Ashton came to Donovan's quarters that night. What occurred in those quarters would remain private between them, but what followed would eventually become very public and very controversial. The night visit became a pattern. Ashton returned to Donovan's quarters the following night, and the night after that. Within a week, Ashton was visiting Donovan's quarters almost every night, arriving after evening intelligence briefings ended and departing before dawn. The pattern was evident to anyone paying attention. Other officers in the quarters noticed Ashton's regular nighttime visits. Support personnel assigned to maintain the officers' quarters noticed the pattern. By September 1967, the situation was becoming difficult to conceal. Captain Robert Mitchell, another intelligence officer who lived in adjacent quarters to Donovan, observed the pattern and was unsure how to respond. The situation was clearly outside normal military propriety. An Australian officer was regularly visiting an American female officer's quarters late at night. The implications were obvious. But what was Mitchell supposed to do? Report the situation to military leadership? That seemed like an overreach. Donovan was an adult. Ashton was an adult. If they were engaging in a consensual relationship, was that truly a military matter? Mitchell decided to say nothing. He observed the situation, kept his concerns private, and hoped the situation would resolve itself. But military institutions have intelligence networks and communication channels that are difficult to avoid. By late September 1967, word of Donovan's nighttime visits from an Australian officer had reached the attention of senior military leadership. Colonel Edward Mason, the same officer who had been concerned about relationships between American female officers and Australian soldiers, learned of the situation through intelligence channels. Mason was more than concerned. Mason was outraged. An American female intelligence officer was engaging in a relationship with a foreign military officer and was conducting that relationship in military quarters. From Mason's perspective, this represented a security risk, a violation of military propriety, and potentially a breach of classified information protection. Mason initiated an investigation. Military investigators were assigned to document Donovan's activities and her relationship with Ashton. The investigators were tasked with determining whether any classified information had been compromised and whether Donovan was engaging in conduct unbecoming an officer. The investigation was conducted discreetly but thoroughly. Investigators interviewed personnel who had observed Ashton's visits to Donovan's quarters. Investigators reviewed Donovan's work schedule and compared it to Ashton's visits. Investigators examined whether Ashton had accessed classified information through his visits to Donovan's quarters. The investigation took approximately 3 weeks. When it concluded, the investigators had documented a clear pattern of nighttime visits to Donovan's quarters by Ashton. The investigators had also concluded that there was no evidence that classified information had been compromised, but the pattern of visits was undeniable. An American female intelligence officer was regularly inviting a foreign military officer to her quarters late at night. The situation, regardless of whether classified information was involved, represented exactly the kind of behavior that military leadership believed was inappropriate. Colonel Mason brought the results of the investigation to the commanding general at MACV. The general, Lieutenant General David Holden, reviewed the findings and was troubled by what he read. An American female officer engaged in a relationship with an Australian officer was already problematic from the perspective of military propriety and military culture. But the specific conduct documented in the investigation, regular nighttime visits to the officer's private quarters, went beyond simply developing a relationship. It suggested a relationship that was explicitly sexual in nature. The military's approach to such situations had historically been to remove the officers from the situation and reassign them. General Holden decided to follow this precedent. Donovan would be reassigned out of Vietnam. Ashton would be recalled to Australia. But removing the officers from the situation would not eliminate the larger problem. Word of the situation had already spread through the officers' corps at MACV. Multiple officers were aware that Donovan had been conducting a relationship with an Australian officer. Multiple officers were aware that she had been inviting the officer to her quarters regularly. By early October 1967, the situation had become something of a scandal within the intelligence community. The scandal was not public, but it was known within military circles. When Donovan was informed that she was being reassigned and that the reason was her relationship with Ashton, Donovan responded with anger and defiance. "I have not violated any military regulation," Donovan told the officer who informed her of the reassignment. "I have not compromised classified information. I have not engaged in any conduct that affects my professional performance. The military has no right to reassign me based on my personal relationship with another adult." The officer delivering the reassignment order was sympathetic to Donovan's position, but was bound by the orders he had received. The reassignment was effective immediately. Donovan was to complete her intelligence work and depart Vietnam within 7 days. Donovan requested a meeting with General Holden. Holden reluctantly agreed to see her. "Sir, I want to understand the basis for this reassignment," Donovan said when she met with Holden. "What regulation have I violated?" Holden was uncomfortable with the situation. He understood that Donovan had a legitimate question. She had not explicitly violated any written regulation. "Your conduct is inconsistent with military propriety," Holden replied finally. "An American female intelligence officer regularly inviting a foreign military officer to her private quarters constitutes conduct that undermines military discipline and order." "With respect, sir, I do not believe that is true," Donovan said. "My personal relationships do not affect my professional performance. I have access to classified information, and I have protected that information appropriately. I have not compromised security. My reassignment is based on disapproval of my personal choices, not on violation of military regulations." Holden was quiet for a long moment. "You are correct that you have not technically violated any written regulation," he said finally. "But the situation you have created is problematic. Your conduct has raised questions among other officers about military propriety. That in itself justifies action. But the action is based on my personal choices, not on professional failure," Donovan responded. "That means the military is punishing me for exercising personal autonomy." The meeting ended without resolution. Holden had made clear that the reassignment would proceed.
Donovan had made clear that she believed the reassignment was unjust.
Word of Donovan's reassignment and the reasons for it spread through the officers' corps. The situation became increasingly controversial. Some officers believed that Donovan deserved to be reassigned. Others believed that the military had overreached in attempting to control Donovan's personal relationships. The female officers in particular were outraged. Donovan was being punished for her personal choices, not for professional failure. The message being sent was that the military had the right to control the personal relationships and personal conduct of female officers. This message was received with anger by many of the female officers serving in Vietnam. Female officers had joined the military to do professional work. They had not joined to have their personal lives subject to military control. Captain Margaret Chen, the same officer who had been involved in a serious relationship with Australian Major Robertson, spoke privately with Donovan before Donovan's departure. Chen was sympathetic to Donovan's situation and angry at the military's response. "They cannot do this to you," Chen said. "They cannot reassign you based on your personal relationship." "But they are doing it," Donovan replied, "and there is nothing I can do to stop it." Donovan departed Vietnam in October 1967. She was reassigned to a position at Fort Meade in Maryland, far removed from Vietnam and from the international intelligence operations that she had been conducting in Southeast Asia. For Donovan, the reassignment represented a significant career setback. She had been conducting cutting-edge intelligence work in Vietnam. Her reassignment to Fort Meade removed her from that work and relegated her to more routine intelligence duties. Major David Ashton was recalled to Australia. The Australian military indicated that Ashton's continued assignment to Vietnam was no longer necessary. Ashton returned to Australia and continued his military career, but the abrupt recall suggested that the Australian military had been pressured to remove him from the situation. The official reason given for Donovan's reassignment was administrative adjustment and rotation of personnel. No mention was made of her relationship with Ashton. No mention was made of the investigation. To outside observers, Donovan's reassignment appeared to be routine personnel movement. But within the intelligence community, everyone understood what had occurred. Donovan had been reassigned because of her relationship with an Australian officer. Ashton had been recalled to Australia because of his relationship with an American female officer. The message being sent was clear. The military disapproved of relationships between American female officers and foreign military officers. Officers engaged in such relationships would face career consequences. But the message also created resistance. Female officers recognized that they were being subjected to restrictions and punishments that were based on disapproval of their personal choices rather than on professional failure. By late 1967 and early 1968, the situation involving Donovan's reassignment had become a focal point for broader conversations among female officers about military authority and personal autonomy. In officers' clubs and in private conversations, female officers discussed whether the military had the right to control their personal relationships. They discussed whether reassignment based on personal conduct that did not violate written regulations was appropriate. They discussed whether they were willing to remain in a military institution that exercised such control. These conversations, occurring in private and not documented in any official records, represented a significant shift in how female officers were thinking about their relationship with military authority. Patricia Donovan remained in the military, but never again achieved the level of influence or the kind of cutting-edge work that she had been conducting in Vietnam. Her career continued, but her reassignment from Vietnam had marked her. She was known as the officer who had been reassigned because of her relationship with an Australian officer. This reputation, while not explicitly stated in any official records, affected how Donovan was treated by other officers. She was viewed with a mixture of sympathy and disapproval, depending on the officer's perspective on the legitimacy of the military's action against her. By 1970, when Donovan eventually left the military, she had become somewhat of a symbol within the female officer community. She represented the cost of asserting personal autonomy against military authority. Years later, Donovan was interviewed about her experience. She spoke with bitterness about how the military had treated her. "They reassigned me because they disapproved of my relationship with an Australian officer," Donovan said. "They did not reassign me because I violated any regulation or compromised any information. They reassigned me because I exercised personal autonomy in choosing my own romantic relationship. That the military felt it had the right to punish me for that choice is something I have never forgiven." Donovan's experience had been more controversial than that of other female officers who had developed relationships with Australian soldiers. The regular nighttime visits to her quarters had made the relationship explicit and public in ways that other relationships were not. The military's response had been correspondingly harsh. But Donovan's experience also created a precedent. It demonstrated that the military was willing to use career consequences to punish female officers for personal relationships that the military disapproved of. This precedent, while intended to discourage such relationships, actually had the opposite effect. It demonstrated to female officers that military authority was being used to control their personal lives in ways that were not being applied to male officers. It demonstrated the inequality embedded in military authority. This understanding of inequality became a catalyst for broader questioning of military authority and military culture. By the 1970s and 1980s, female military officers were increasingly willing to challenge military directives regarding personal relationships. They were increasingly unwilling to accept that the military had the right to control their personal conduct. The case of Patricia Donovan became a reference point in these conversations. Donovan had been treated harshly by the military, and her harsh treatment had demonstrated the potential consequences of asserting personal autonomy. But her willingness to assert that autonomy, regardless of the consequences, became inspiring to other female officers. The slouch hat and the boots represented Australian military effectiveness in tactical and physical domains. Patricia Donovan's night visits represented something different. They represented the assertion of personal autonomy in the face of military authority that disapproved of the exercise of that autonomy. Donovan's story was not celebrated or commemorated. It was not recognized in official military histories, but it was remembered within the female officer community as a story of someone who had paid a price for asserting personal autonomy. That willingness to pay a price and the sympathy of other female officers for Donovan's situation contributed to a broader evolution in how military institutions approached questions of personal relationships and personal autonomy. By the year 2000, American military regulations explicitly protected the right of military personnel to develop personal relationships without fear of career consequences, provided those relationships did not create conflicts of interest or compromise professional duties. This represented a complete reversal from 1967, when Patricia Donovan had been reassigned because of her relationship with an Australian officer. The reversal had not occurred because military leadership had suddenly recognized that the previous approach was wrong. The reversal had occurred because female officers had resisted the restrictions and had been willing to pay the costs of that resistance. Patricia Donovan never returned to Vietnam. She never returned to the kind of cutting-edge intelligence work that she had been conducting when she was reassigned. Her career continued, but at a reduced level of influence and impact. The Australian military, aware of Donovan's reassignment and the reasons for it, came to view the American military's approach to personal relationships as overly restrictive and based on cultural assumptions rather than on legitimate military concerns. This perception contributed to the Australian understanding that the American military was more rigid and more controlling of personal autonomy than Australian military culture permitted. The Australian military did not intervene in the situation. The Australians did not formally protest Donovan's reassignment or Ashton's recall. But the Australian military's awareness of how the Americans had treated one of their officers contributed to Australian skepticism about American military culture. This skepticism, while not leading to direct conflict, influenced how Australians related to American military personnel and how Australians viewed American military institutions. Donovan lived until 2004. In her final years, she was interviewed by military historians researching the Vietnam War and the experience of female officers. Donovan spoke about her experience with the distance that comes with time, but also with continuing anger about how she had been treated. "The military felt it had the right to control my personal life," Donovan said in one interview. "The military reassigned me because I exercised personal autonomy that the military disapproved of. That is a form of control that I have never accepted as legitimate." The military is a hierarchical institution, but there are limits to how far that hierarchy should extend. My personal relationships were my own concern, not the military's concern. This statement, made decades after the events in question, reflected a perspective that had become increasingly common among female military officers. The idea that the military could or should control the personal relationships of military personnel had come to be seen as inappropriate and based on sexism rather than on legitimate military concerns. The most significant legacy of Patricia Donovan's experience was that it demonstrated the potential costs of asserting personal autonomy against military authority. But it also demonstrated that some officers were willing to pay that cost in order to maintain their autonomy. That willingness, when multiplied across multiple female officers facing similar situations, contributed to institutional change. The slouch hat and the boots were symbols of Australian military effectiveness that were celebrated and remembered. Patricia Donovan's nighttime visits with an Australian officer were symbols of the assertion of personal autonomy against military authority that were forgotten and deliberately not commemorated. But both types of symbols represented the influence of the Australian presence in Vietnam on American military evolution. The slouch hat influenced American military tactics. The boots influenced American physical training. The nighttime visits influenced American military culture regarding questions of authority and personal autonomy. All of these influences resulted from the same basic pattern. The Australians conducted their military operations in ways that were adapted to the specific conditions of Vietnam. Americans observed the Australian methods. Americans either accepted or resisted the methods. Gradually, over time, American military evolved to incorporate or respond to the Australian examples. Patricia Donovan's nighttime visits were not intentional exemplars of anything. They were simply a woman exercising personal autonomy in choosing to develop a relationship with another adult. But the military's response to those visits, and the broader female officer response to that military response, contributed to institutional evolution. That evolution would have occurred regardless of Donovan's specific situation. But Donovan's situation contributed to the timing and the nature of that evolution. By the year 2020, more than 50 years after Donovan's reassignment, American military regulations explicitly protected personal relationships between military personnel and foreign military personnel, provided those relationships did not create conflicts of interest or compromise professional duties. This represented not just a reversal of the military's 1967 approach, but a fundamental acceptance that military authority did not extend to control over personal relationships. Patricia Donovan did not live to see this evolution fully complete, but she had been willing to assert her autonomy in 1967, knowing that doing so would likely have career consequences. That willingness to accept consequences in order to maintain personal autonomy became the foundation for institutional change. The Australian soldiers and officers who had been involved in relationships with American female officers did not understand at the time that they were contributing to institutional change in the American military. They understood only that they were attracted to American women, and that those American women were interested in relationships with them. But the relationships themselves, and the American military's responses to those relationships, became the vehicle through which questions about military authority and personal autonomy were forced to be confronted. The slouch hat and the boots were visible. Donovan's nighttime visits were invisible. But both shaped how the American military evolved during and after the Vietnam War.